Archduke's Wrong Turn. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade was supposed to follow a planned route through Sarajevo. His driver took a wrong turn down Franz Joseph Street and then tried to back up. While the car sat there, basically stationary, Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing right there on the corner. He stepped forward and shot the Archduke and his wife Sophie at point-blank range. That single wrong turn put the most important assassination target of the era directly in front of one of the conspirators who'd been trying to kill him all day, Xerxes' bridge blunder. In 480 BCE, Persian King Xerxes wanted to invade Greece, so he ordered engineers to build a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, which is about a mile wide at its narrowest point. They lashed together hundreds of boats with flax and papyrus cables to create a floating roadway. When a storm rolled through and wrecked the whole thing, Xerxes lost his mind and ordered his men to whip the sea 300 times as punishment. He also had the engineers beheaded. They built a second bridge with stronger cables, and his massive army crossed into Greece. But the overconfident campaign ended in disaster when the Greeks defeated him. Napoleon's Russian Winter. Napoleon rolled into Russia in 1812 with over 600,000 men, but he seriously underestimated what winter there actually meant. His supply lines stretched so far back that food and warm clothing barely reached the front, and when the Russians burned Moscow rather than let him have it, he had nothing to take. The retreat turned into a nightmare. Men froze to death in their sleep, horses collapsed and got eaten immediately, and Russian forces kept harassing the survivors. By the time what was left of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the border, fewer than 100,000 were still alive. Titanic speed gamble. The Titanic was doing about 22 knots through pitch-black water on the night of April 14, 1912, despite receiving 6 iceberg warnings that day. Captain Smith kept that speed because slowing down wasn't standard practice back then, and the ship had a reputation to uphold as the fastest luxury liner on its maiden voyage. The lookouts had no binoculars, which didn't help, and when they finally spotted the iceberg, it was too late to turn a ship that massive. The collision buckled the hull across 6 compartments, and with only enough lifeboats for about half the people on board, over 1,500 drowned in the freezing Atlantic. Chernobyl's safety test. The test was supposed to prove the reactor could safely coast through a power outage using its own momentum. Instead, operators disabled safety systems and let the power drop way too low. When they tried bringing it back up, the reactor's design flaw kicked in. More power meant more heat, which made more steam, which created even more power. Within seconds, the whole thing spiraled out of control. The explosion blew the roof off, exposed the core to open air, and sent radioactive smoke across Europe for days. Chamberlain's appeasement. Chamberlain genuinely believed he could avoid war by giving Hitler what he wanted. At Munich in 1938, he handed over part of Czechoslovakia without even asking the Czechs. Hitler promised this was his last demand, and Chamberlain flew home waving the agreement, declaring peace for our time. The problem is, Hitler was never going to stop. Every concession just convinced him that Britain and France were weak and wouldn't fight. By the time they finally drew a line, Germany had spent a year building up its military and swallowing territory, making the coming war far bloodier than it needed to be. Trojan horse acceptance. The Trojans made one of history's biggest mistakes when they dragged that massive wooden horse through their gates. The Greeks had supposedly sailed away after 10 years of siege, leaving this giant horse as an offering to the gods. A few people warned that it was a trap, but the city was so relieved the war seemed over that they ignored them. Inside the horse sat a bunch of Greek soldiers waiting for nightfall. Once the city fell asleep, they climbed out, opened the gates for their army, and Troy burned. Decca rejects the Beatles. On New Year's Day 1962, 4 young guys from Liverpool walked into Decca Records in London and recorded 15 songs in under an hour. The studio was cold, they were nervous, and the session went badly. A few weeks later, Decca's head of artists and repertoire, Dick Rowe, turned them down. He told their manager Brian Epstein that guitar groups were on the way out and the Beatles had no future in show business. Decca signed a band called Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead. Within 2 years, the Beatles were the biggest act on the planet, and Decca had blown what would become a billion-dollar mistake. Challenger's O-rings. On January 28, 1986, NASA launched the Space Shuttle Challenger, even though engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned them the night before not to do it. The problem was the O-rings, basically rubber seals between sections of the solid rocket boosters. These rings were supposed to keep hot gases from leaking out, but they got stiff and didn't seal properly in cold weather. Launch day was freezing, around 36 degrees Fahrenheit. 73 seconds after liftoff, hot gas escaped through a failed O-ring, burned through the external fuel tank, and the whole thing exploded. All 7 crew members died instantly. Columbus's calculation error. Columbus thought he could reach Asia by sailing west, but his math was way off. He believed the Earth was about 25% smaller than it actually is, and he also thought Asia stretched much farther east than it does. These 2 mistakes combined made him think the journey would be relatively short, maybe a few thousand miles. When he landed in the Caribbean after a month at sea, he genuinely believed he'd reached the outskirts of Asia. He died still thinking he'd found a route to the Indies, never realizing he'd stumbled onto entirely different continents. Blockbuster passes Netflix. In 2000, Netflix was just a DVD by mail service losing money, and they pitched Blockbuster on a buyout for $50 million. Blockbuster looked at the offer and passed, figuring their brick-and-mortar stores were doing fine and this little internet company wasn't worth the investment. They completely misread where entertainment was heading. Fast forward 10 years and Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, while Netflix had pivoted to streaming and was worth billions. The company that could have owned Netflix for pocket change ended up shutting down nearly all its stores. It's one of the most expensive no-thanks in business history. Maginot Line fixation. France spent a fortune building the Maginot Line in the 1930s, this massive chain of fortresses and bunkers along the German border. Now, the defenses were genuinely impressive, with artillery, machine gun nests, underground barracks, even railways connecting the forts. French military planners figured no army could punch through it. The problem was they left the Ardennes forest to the north, barely defended because they thought the terrain was too difficult for tanks and large formations to cross. Germany just drove right through Belgium and the Ardennes in 1940 with their armored divisions, bypassing the whole fortification system. France fell in 6 weeks.